Good evening. Welcome to Hasta, Ocho, your half hour of local and regional news, features, weather, and other information. I'm Mike Clifford. According to the Albuquerque Journal, New Mexico Governor Susana Martinez struck a stern tone yesterday in her sixth State of the State address, urging lawmakers to enact tougher criminal penalties, pass bills aimed at job creation, and demand more than mediocrity in New Mexico's public schools as a 30-day legislative session got underway. But top-ranking Democratic legislators responded by blasting the governor's agenda as politically motivated. The governor's 47-minute address to lawmakers focused heavily on a recent spate of high-profile crimes. The state's two-term Republican governor called specifically on lawmakers to pass stricter anti-DWI laws and broaden the state's three strikes law for repeat offenders. In his official response to the governor's address, Senate Majority Leader Michael Sanchez, a Democrat from Belen, said he agrees on the importance of criminal justice reform, but offered different solutions, such as more money for drug and alcohol rehabilitation programs. An Associated Press story in the Pueblo Chieftain reports the death of Eagles co-founder Glenn Frey has some Aspen residents remembering the band's early days in the resort town. The Aspen Times reports that Frey and his original bandmates played their first extended show as the Eagles at a long-gone club at the base of Little Nell, the Gallery, in 1971. They were brought to town by Jimmy Buffett's manager, Irving Azoff, to develop their live show. In a 2010 story in the Times, Frey recalled that there were just 40 people for the band's first set, but the club was packed by the time they played a fourth set that night. Frey, who had a home in Aspen, told the Times that the song Party Town was partially inspired by Aspen. The U.S. Supreme Court's decision to hear an appeal by the Obama administration to expand programs shielding families from the threat of deportation is being celebrated by immigrant rights groups. If an executive order is allowed to go forward, at least 4 million residents could gain protections. Eric Galatis has more.
A coalition of immigrants' rights groups is taking to the streets today, celebrating the U.S. Supreme Court's decision to hear a case that blocked the Obama administration's efforts to shield undocumented families from deportation. In Denver, street theater was planned for noon Wednesday, dramatizing what's at stake for families. Arturo Hernandez Garcia spent 9 months in sanctuary in a church to avoid being separated from his wife and 2 children. He commended the Supreme Court's move.
It's very important they keep together families. It's very important for the citizen kids. They continue living a normal life with their parents.
Last year, a federal appeals court ruled the Obama administration overstepped its authority and put the brakes on an executive action that would have granted permission to millions of undocumented children and parents to live and work in the U.S. The Supreme Court's ruling on the case is expected this spring. If the court rules that Obama's 2014 executive action can go forward, at least 4 million people could gain protection from deportation. Jennifer Piper with the American Friends Service Committee says even if the court sides with the administration, more needs to be done. She says some 6 million other residents would still be at risk because they don't have children who are U.S. citizens.
It's one critical step to keep families together and to give people a small measure of security in their everyday lives. But what we really need is Congress to enact immigration policy that's just and humane, that recognizes the human dignity of everyone in our communities.
Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, who initially challenged the executive order, said in a statement he's confident the High Court will agree with 3 lower court decisions to limit presidential powers. This is Eric Galatis reporting for the Colorado News Connection.
The Obama administration has ordered a halt to new or modified permits to mine coal on public lands in New Mexico and elsewhere. The order also mandates a review of the royalty structure for coal mined on federal lands. The move is drawing praise from environmental interests and clean energy advocates. Mark Richardson tells us more.
Environmental groups and clean energy advocates in New Mexico and elsewhere are praising the Obama administration's move to suspend new coal mining on public lands. Interior Secretary Sally Jewell issued an executive order on Friday that puts a moratorium on new or modified permits and orders a review of the federal coal royalty program. Camilla Feebleman, director of the Rio Grande chapter of the Sierra Club, says the royalties paid by coal miners on public lands have been shortchanging the public for decades.
Taxpayers may have lost upwards of $30 billion in revenue over the past 30 years. Money that would go to fund schools and roads and projects very local to the places where the coal extraction actually takes place.
Feebleman says beyond the environmental problems related to the mining and burning of coal, operators on public lands often use shell companies and other accounting tricks to pay royalties as low as $13 a ton when the market rate is as high as $60 a ton. She says federal royalty rates for strip mine coal have not changed in almost 40 years. She says there are currently 3 major coal mines on public lands in New Mexico, all operating near coal-fired power plants.
The main mines are San Juan mine, which feeds the San Juan generating station, the Navajo mine that feeds the Four Corners power plant, and Lee Ranch, which feeds the Escalante power plant.
Feebleman says that about 40% of all the coal mined in the United States comes from public lands. She adds that the executive order does not affect coal leases that are currently in operation. For New Mexico News Connection, I'm Mark Richardson.
Meanwhile, climate advocates energized by that U.S. Department of the Interior announcement to stop new coal mining leases on public lands are gearing up to make the move permanent. Priorities for reforming the nation's coal program include reducing climate pollution and transitioning coal workers to more sustainable jobs. Eric Galatis has more.
Groups working to prevent the most catastrophic impacts of climate change say they'll double down on organizing efforts after Secretary of the Interior Sally Jewell announced a sweeping overhaul of how publicly owned coal is managed. Theo Spencer with the Natural Resources Defense Council says the 3-year review process is an opportunity for people who care about public lands, clean air, or climate action to keep coal, the largest source of climate pollution, in the ground.
These are public lands, and fortunately, this overhaul is going to be a public process, so there's going to be plenty of opportunity for people to do what they need to do to get their points of view in to the Department of Interior.
The National Mining Association and some politicians denounced the move and said the moratorium imposed on new leases for coal on public lands could lead to job loss and block access to low-cost energy. Spencer says the industry has at least 20 years worth of coal under current leases and says the sooner a serious transition to clean energy begins, states that rely on coal will see more sustainable jobs come online. Solar already employs 77% more people than coal, according to a new report by the Solar Foundation. The Sierra Club says the moratorium is a chance to push policymakers to help coal workers get the training they need to build the nation's clean energy future. Spencer admits that stopping new coal leases won't make an immediate impact on slowing climate change, but says it sends a powerful signal to energy markets, politicians, and other countries.
We're serious about dealing with our dirtiest source of energy and making sure that if we're going to use it, that we get the right price for it and that it's done in a clear and transparent fashion.
The Center for American Progress is also mobilizing after the announcement. In a release, the group said priorities for the overhaul should include reducing climate pollution, making sure taxpayers get a fair return when publicly owned coal is mined, and holding companies responsible for cleaning up their mining operations. This is Eric Galatis reporting for the Colorado News Connection.
The latest annual Kids Count report lists New Mexico with the highest rate of child poverty among the 50 states. The report, released yesterday, finds the status of New Mexico's next generation has improved in some categories, but children's advocates are calling on state officials to make changes to bring more kids out of poverty. More from Mark Richardson.
Despite gains in other areas, New Mexico children are ranked last among the 50 states for their high poverty rate, according to the annual Kids Count report. The latest data released today shows that of the 16 factors cited, New Mexico kids made gains in a few areas, including a decline in teen births and higher graduation rates. But Veronica Garcia, director of the group New Mexico Voices for Children, says poverty often places obstacles in front of kids.
Child poverty is at the root of many of these poor child outcomes. That is not to say that children in poverty can't learn or that children in poverty can't be healthy, but they do need support to be able to keep up with their non-disadvantaged peers.
Garcia says there are a number of programs the state could implement or strengthen to help children thrive, including more funding for early childhood education and enrolling more children in health insurance programs. She adds that the state must work with their families to improve children's lives. She says steps like raising the minimum wage, capping interest on predatory lending, and increasing the working family's tax credit could all make a difference.
Substantial gains can be made by what is called a two-generation approach. So you work with the adult in terms of increasing their education, but we also work with the children in terms of programs like early childhood education.
Garcia says New Mexico Voices for Children is calling for more money from the legislature for pre-kindergarten, including putting a constitutional amendment before voters to add a 0.5% tax to fund early education. For New Mexico News Connection, I'm Mark Richardson.
The number of Hispanic children without health insurance in Colorado dropped by 26% the first year the Affordable Care Act took effect. But Hispanic kids still have a higher uninsured rate than their peers. Eric Galatis reports.
More Hispanic children in Colorado have health insurance, but they're still lagging behind their peers, according to a new report by a Georgetown University Research Center and the National Council of La Raza. The report found the number of Hispanic kids without coverage dropped from more than 50,000 in 2013 to nearly 37,000 in 2014. The uninsured rate for Hispanic children is still high at 10% compared with 6% for all other kids. Mirna Ramirez Castro with Servicios de la Raza says the state is headed in the right direction, but more can be done.
It's not just the coverage, but how do we get the community to use their benefits under preventative services and avoiding that emergency care cost. So there's still a lot of work to be done, not just in Colorado, but nationally.
She adds that nearly 93% of Hispanic children in Colorado have legal status and 2/3 are eligible for free or low-cost health insurance. But she says due to language barriers and a persistent anti-immigrant atmosphere, many parents without legal status continue to be reluctant to enroll their kids. The study found the number of Hispanic children nationally without insurance reached an historic low in 2014, the first year the Affordable Care Act took effect. Sonia Schwartz with Georgetown University's Center for Children and Families says a key to getting more kids covered is getting the word out before open enrollment closes at the end of January.
We're focusing a lot right now on the outreach and enrollment aspect because this is the end of the open enrollment period. There are 2 more weeks for people to enroll in healthcare.gov and state marketplaces. And so we want to make sure that we reach all the remaining eligible but uninsured Hispanic kids.
Schwartz notes that enrollment in Medicaid and Colorado CHP Plus is open year-round. She says removing barriers to enrollment and making coverage more affordable should be a top priority for policymakers who want to see all children succeed. This is Eric Galatis reporting for the Colorado News Connection.
Our guest today is filmmaker John J. Valdez. He's a longtime Peabody Award-winning filmmaker, 2 Emmy nominations, written and directed a dozen nationally broadcast documentary films for PBS and CNN over the past 2 years, or past 18 years, and he is going to be in Alamosa at Adams State University at 7 p.m. Tuesday, January 26th to show and talk about his film, The Head of Joaquin Murrieta, Lynching, Legends, and Love in the Wild West. And thanks for talking with us today.
Hey, thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So, I guess, first off, the description I saw about this film was that it'll examine the difficult history of Mexican-American lynchings in the Southwest, but there's a particular story that goes along with Joaquin Murrieta, right?
Yeah. Joaquin Murrieta, during the California Gold Rush, the first miners to mine for gold out in California were the people who had already lived in the area, the Californios. And most of those were Mexican. And then the next wave who came to the California Gold Rush were from northern Mexico. And this is just because of, the geography of the area. Those are the places that were nearest. And one of those miners, according to the story, is this young guy named Joaquin Murrieta, who gets a mining claim, and then as the 49ers come in, right, they begin to jump other people's claims who have already taken the best mining areas. And Murrieta's land his claim is taken, and his wife is murdered, and that sends him on a path of revenge against the people who had murdered his wife and taken his land, and makes him an outlaw. And so the film is kind of built around the story of this legendary Mexican outlaw in the early California history.
And is that something you use that as a tool, I guess, to examine the more general topic of lynchings, Mexican-American lynchings in the Southwest? And
well, you know what ends up happening is that Joaquin Murrieta, according to the story, now we don't know to what extent this story is true or to what extent it's just become legend. Okay, so we should be clear about that. That this entire story of Joaquin Murrieta is kind of a mixture of history and legend. And so according to the story, he goes on a killing spree, and he starts killing Americans who have come to the California gold fields kind of in retribution for what was done to him. And eventually the governor of California, John Bigler, dispatches a group of professional bounty hunters, cutthroats really, to go hunt down this notorious Mexican outlaw, and they were called the California Rangers. And so they return 1 month later with a severed human head in a jar, and collect the reward money, and then begin to display the jar in saloons and brothels and hotels all across California, and charge people $1 to see their trophy. And of course, this instills fear into the Mexican population, and a period of ethnic violence in California ensues, where Mexicans are driven out of the gold fields and huddle in little communities along California, places like the Mission District in San Francisco, Santa Barbara, East LA. Those Mexican barrios today were formed in large measure because of the ethnic cleansing that took place in California in the 1850s. And so this film looks at Joaquin Murrieta's story as a springboard to look at the racial violence against Mexican Americans that took place not just in California, but all across the West, including in Colorado.
And I want to talk more about that, but quickly, one thing I saw, and maybe you can confirm or deny this, but that the story of Joaquin Murrieta was one of the inspirations for Zorro.
Well, yeah. Well, interestingly enough, and this is something I'm actually writing a piece about for a publication that's going to be out pretty soon. But it actually goes farther than that. The character for the Lone Ranger, right? If you remember that from when you were a kid, the Lone Ranger was based on Zorro, and the story of Zorro was based on Joaquin Murrieta. And so it's interesting to note that within the span of 100 years, so from the 1850s to 1950, right, within the span of 100 years, this Mexican who was seen as having all of these attributes of being a master of disguise, of being able to avoid the law, and was kind of a Robin Hood figure. Within 100 years, those attributes switch, and they're put onto this mythical character Zorro, right, which is set in 19th century Spain. And then a few years later, those same attributes are put onto the Lone Ranger, And it's interesting because the people who hunted down Joaquin Murrieta were the California Rangers. So the very people who hunted down Joaquin Murrieta would 100 years later be lionized as these sort of as an early American kind of superhero that began as a Mexican American and is now as a white guy with a Native American sidekick.
Yeah, it's
on television.
Right. It's interesting to me the way I think both a lot of people would be surprised to know that the Lone Ranger had those roots, and it's also kind of an example of co-opting the culture by the dominant culture.
Right. Well, and I would even take it further. I think when most people think about American history or the history of the West, we think of pioneers, going west. In the wagon trains. We think of cowboys and Indians, right? We might think of the 49ers mining for gold. We may even think of the Buffalo Soldiers, okay? But rarely do we think of Mexicans as being an integral part of the history of the West. And in a way, the way that Joaquin Murrieta was sort of co-opted and transformed into the Lone Ranger is kind of in some ways is a metaphor for how Mexicans and Mexican Americans have been written out of history or ignored or dismissed or just not included in the story of America when we think back in the popular imagination and try to remember who we are as a continental people.
Yeah, and I guess this film would kind of be part of an effort to help remedy that. And so I want to find out more about these events that happened after the death of Joaquin Murrieta. And we have a lot of listeners in New Mexico too, so I don't know. You mentioned there was things going on in Colorado, but if you know anything about that too, that'd be great. What are some of the things that happened? The press release mentions lynchings, and I think that's something, as you mentioned, that has been. If we think of lynchings, we usually, often at least, think about black men, and not so much about the Chicanos in the Southwest. But that was something that happened too.
Yeah, it's interesting. According to recent scholarship, there have been 871 documented lynchings of Mexican Americans in 12 Western states. And those are the ones that we know about. Those are the ones that are documented. And that doesn't include, the people who were just murdered and, left in the desert, as it were.
Right.
And in fact, in proportion to their numbers, Mexicans were lynched in the West as often as African Americans were lynched in the South. So that if you imagine the kind of racial violence that has been levied against African Americans in our history in the South, well, in proportion and in equal measure, that same racial violence was also aimed directly at Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the West, in places like Texas and New Mexico, California, Nevada, Colorado. And that has a lot of implications for today because, that entire story is generally not, it's not what we think of in the public imagination when we think of the history of the West. And when Mexican Americans are written out of the American story and not thought of as being an integral part of our, national story, then we tend to think of Mexicans or Mexican Americans as newcomers, as interlopers, as illegals who have maybe come across the border just recently. And we think of them as not really being American. We think of them as people who, maybe we kind of tolerate, but aren't really, one of us. And that's a pretty that's a pretty profound thing to think about, especially when you start to consider the rapidly changing demographics that are not only transforming Colorado, but are transforming the entire nation. By 2050, there will be no racial or ethnic majority in this country. We will be a nation of minorities, and by the end of the 21st century, if demographers are correct, we will be a Latino country. And so it seems to me that it's rather important that we try to span divides of difference and find new connections for positive change, and try to understand our common history and our common past in a way that recognizes that we have always been a pluralistic society, so that we can move forward in a positive way.
Yeah, and of course, most of the Southwest, what we call the Southwest, was actually Mexico at one time. So if anybody should be looked at as interlopers, it wouldn't be the Mexicans and Mexican Americans.
Yeah, but I think I don't want to turn the tables on white people. That's not my goal. I guess what I would like to see is an understanding that that in the America of the 21st century, that we all belong here, that we all call this place home, and that we have to find positive ways of working together, of accommodating one another, of building our national strength built on our diversity, and that's why I think it's so troubling, when we see some of the things going on in the current political debates that are almost the politics of hate rather than the politics of hope, or the politics of how we can pull together as a nation. And understanding that history is painful as it is an important part of the healing process, so that we can all move forward together as Americans.
John J. Valadez, he'll be presenting his film, The Head of Joaquin Murrieta, Lynching, Legends, and Love in the Wild West, a week from yesterday, Tuesday, January 26th, at Adams State University in McDaniel Hall, room 101. The event will begin at 7 o'clock, and the event is free and open to the public, and we plan to have more of our discussion with John J. Valadez tomorrow here on A las Ocho and Hasta las Ocho. Weather. In the San Luis Valley, tonight mostly cloudy with a 20% chance of snow, lows 0 to 8, northwest winds 10 to 15 miles an hour. Tomorrow, sunny, highs near 30, northwest winds up to 10 miles an hour, wind chill readings 10 below to 0. Tomorrow night, mostly clear, lows 9 below to 1 above 0, light winds. Friday, mostly sunny, highs in the lower to mid-30s, light winds. Friday night and Saturday, partly cloudy, lows 5 below to 5 above 0, highs in the mid to upper 30s. Saturday night, partly cloudy, lows 8 to 14. Sunday through Monday, mostly cloudy with a 10% chance of snow, highs 28 to 35, lows 5 to 11. Monday night, partly cloudy, lows 1 below to 5 above 0. And Tuesday in the San Luis Valley, sunny, highs near 30. For north central New Mexico, tonight, breezy, partly cloudy with isolated snow showers, lows 5 to 15, west winds 15 to 25 miles an hour, becoming north 10 to 20 miles an hour after midnight. Below canyons, northwest winds 10 to 15 miles an hour. Tomorrow, mostly sunny, highs in the upper 20s to mid-30s, north winds 10 to 15 miles an hour. Tomorrow night, mostly clear, colder, lows 5 below to 5 above 0, north winds 10 to 15 miles an hour in the evening. Friday, mostly sunny, not as cold, highs in the mid-30s to lower 40s. Friday night, mostly clear, lows 5 to 15. Saturday and Saturday night, partly cloudy, highs in the upper 30s to lower 40s, lows 15 to 25. Sunday, partly cloudy with a slight chance of snow showers, highs in the 30s Sunday night, partly cloudy with a slight chance of snow showers, colder, lows 5 to 20. Monday, partly cloudy with a slight chance of snow showers, highs in the upper 20s to mid 30s. Monday night, partly cloudy with a slight chance of snow showers, colder, lows 0 to 15. And Tuesday in north central New Mexico, mostly sunny, highs in the upper 20s to mid 30s. Thanks for being here for Hasta las Ocho this evening. I'm Mike Clifford, and I'll be back tomorrow evening at 7:30, and I'll be back tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock for A las Ocho. I hope you can join me.